Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. For today's video I have my January wrap-up. I read 8 books in January, which is a bit shocking considering many things went wrong in my life in January, but I've actually been super motivated to read this month, which has been great because over the last year my reading has definitely plummeted to how it used to be, so I'm really glad to be back in this mindset where I really just want to read books again. So without further ado, we have 8 books to go through, so we best get started before this video ends up being super long. So the first book that I picked up in January was Genuine Fraud by E. Lockhart. I have read one other book by E. Lockhart. It was We Were Liars, which I think is probably their most popular book, and I'll be honest, I don't remember much about what that book was about except that the ending was quite shocking, and I believe it was told in a similar way to this book, where the story is actually told in reverse. So each chapter takes place a bit earlier than the last chapter, so the story is told backwards. So in this book we're following our main character, who's a woman who seems to be on the run from something, and she might not be exactly who she says that she is, but we have to read the story backwards to find out exactly what it is that she's running from and what she's doing. Unfortunately, I did not love this book. I think I gave it like 2.5 stars. Personally, as much as the idea of a story told in reverse sounds interesting, it's never worked for me anytime I've read a book written in this way. I don't know why. I think the concept of it is interesting, but I just end up losing interest in the story as I go. I think I would just rather read the story from the beginning to the end. So that is quite unfortunate, but it did kind of pique my interest to reread We Were Liars because I do remember being shocked by the ending of that book, so I might give that a reread. But personally for this, it just didn't really work for me, and I also didn't really care about our main character, and by the end of the story I just felt like I didn't understand what the point of it was. So this was a bit of a dud for my first book, but luckily it didn't end me in a reading slump and I was able to read 7 other books in January, the next one being The Guest List by Lucy Foley. So this is a mystery thriller book that is set during a wedding on a remote Irish island, and we follow several main characters in this book. We read from a lot of different perspectives, and all of these people, different members of the wedding party, seem to have their own secrets that they're hiding. And then we also get a couple of flash forward chapters where we find out after the wedding at the reception someone has turned up dead. So we have to read through all of their perspectives up to that point to find out what has happened. So this was a bit better than the last book. I gave this 3 stars. It was just kind of your average mystery thriller book. There wasn't anything mind-blowing about it, but there also wasn't anything necessarily wrong with the book. It was just kind of your average thriller. I think I will probably end up picking up another book by this author to kind of decide if she is a thriller author for me or not, but overall it was decent enough that I carried on reading the whole thing and I wanted to find out how it ended, but it didn't have any of those big twists that really blow your mind or anything like that. It was just kind of a decent book, but nothing amazing. I then picked up the audiobook for Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing by Matthew Perry. I listened to the version that is narrated by him, which is how I prefer to listen to my memoirs, is to hear them read by the person that wrote them. So yes, this is his memoir that specifically focuses a lot on his addiction, so definitely look up trigger warnings for this book before you pick it up and read it at your own discretion. When it comes to memoirs, I find them very difficult to review, and I don't ever usually give them ratings because it just kind of feels wrong to rate or review a person's life experience, but because of the heavy subject matter of this book, it's also a very difficult one to recommend to people. Obviously, if you're a fan of Matthew Perry or Friends like I am, then I would recommend picking this book up if you feel comfortable with the heavy subject matter of it. But overall, as far as my review, I thought it was a decent memoir. At times it was told out of chronological order, which I'll admit was a little bit confusing, but as a nonfiction book, it wasn't that big of a deal. And there were definitely some questionable parts in here which I know have already been addressed online, and I think Matthew Perry already issued an apology for some of the weird things that were said in this book, but overall I thought it was decent enough. So like I said, if you are a big fan of Matthew Perry or Friends, I would recommend it, but be advised that it does deal with some very heavy content. I then reread It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. This is my third time reading this book. I read it twice before, 5 out of 5 stars both times, but I wanted to reread it as a little refresher for the long-awaited sequel that just released called It Starts With Us. So even though I was pretty sure I could remember what this book was about, I just felt like rereading it again. And I will say this was my first time rereading it after having been in an actual relationship, and wow, did this book hit me way harder this time around, and it will probably be a long while if I ever reread this book again, but I still really enjoyed it. 5 out of 5 stars. If you don't know what this book is about, don't let the cover or any kind of synopsis of this book fool you into thinking that this is a romance book, because that is what it seems like at first. We follow our main character called Lily, and she is kind of going through a rough time after her father just passed away, and she's kind of dealing with the emotions of it because her father was very abusive towards her mother growing up, and she never understood why her mother stayed with him all this time. So she's kind of dealing with the effects of it. She's on the top of a roof, and she ends up meeting this other guy there called Ryle, and they're very attracted to each other right off the bat, and they end up forming a relationship. So again, don't let it fool you that this is a romance book, because it is not. It's actually a very, very heavy book, and once again, definitely look up trigger warnings before you pick this book up, because it is mainly a book about abusive relationships, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's very well done. So like I said, I wanted to reread this in preparation for the sequel, which I read next, and that's It Starts With Us, again by Colleen Hoover. Now, unlike the first book, this one definitely is a romance. There are some heavy themes from the first book that do make a little bit of an appearance in this book, but for the most part, this is a romance. I can't tell you much about it since it is a sequel and I don't want to spoil anybody that hasn't read it yet, but this is told in dual perspectives between Lily and Atlas, and I will say I mostly read this for the Atlas chapters. I did find Lily to be a little bit annoying in this book, but loved Atlas. So I do agree with what everybody else is kind of saying about this book, that it was unnecessary, that it was a bit of a money grab because everybody just wanted a sequel to the first one. I do agree with it, but does that mean I didn't enjoy this book? No. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I did enjoy reading this book. It is just kind of a fun romance book, and I wanted to see what happened with these characters, just like a lot of other people did. By the end of the book, which is why I only gave it 4 and not 5 out of 5 stars, there were still elements of it that I wanted, like, answers to. Like, it wasn't fully a satisfying ending, and I feel like that is what everybody wanted from a sequel, was like to have the story completed, but it still feels like she maybe left it open for more potential, like maybe spin-off series or something like that. So overall, 4 out of 5 stars. I understand what other people are saying, that it was very unnecessary, but I still found it to be entertaining. I then picked up Piranesi by Susanna Clark. In this book, we follow our main character, Piranesi, and he lives in this house that is made up entirely of an endless labyrinth. There is no end to the halls of this home, and it is full of statues, and there's also an ocean that seems to run through this house, a like tidal wave that comes through different halls, and Piranesi has learned how this wave works in the way that he's able to avoid it hitting him when he is exploring this house. And it's just Piranesi living there, except that there's one other person called the Other that meets with Piranesi twice a week to discuss their search for this great and secret knowledge that seems to be in the house somewhere. But as Piranesi continues to explore these endless halls and this labyrinth, he learns that there might actually be another person in this house that he doesn't know. So this was an incredibly interesting book. It ended up being my favorite read of the month. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It definitely has like mythological vibes to it, so if you like Madeline Miller books or something like that, I would totally recommend this book to you. It's also not very big at all, so it's a great quick read. It reads really easy, but it's also not like info dumpy or ever feels rushed, but this does pack such a big punch into such a small book. I just loved everything about it. It had such beautiful writing and storytelling, and the concept of it was so interesting. It's one of those books where it starts off where you're like, what exactly is going on? And then as the story unfolds. It's just very twisty and it's just so interesting. So you're just gonna have to take my word for it and pick this book up because it is definitely going to be one of my favorites of the year, and it's only January, and I think this has just made it into like my top 5. I then picked up the audiobook for The Family Game by Catherine Steadman. This is a book that I picked up on a whim because I was looking for something to listen to while I worked on my crochet projects for January, so this was the first one that kind of caught my attention and I thought the concept of it was interesting. So this is another mystery thriller kind of book. We're following our main character. I've already forgot what her name was, but she is a writer and she is engaged to this man. He's a very rich man, comes from a very wealthy family, but she's never met his family before. But it is now the holidays and he wants her to meet his family. They have this large estate in upstate New York, so she meets his family and turns out this family likes to play a lot of games, some of which might be deadlier than they seem on the surface. So that is essentially the concept of this book. I think it sounds a lot more interesting than it actually is, if I am just being completely honest. This was like a 2-3 star read for me. I think if I was reading this physically, I probably would have DNF'd it, but because I was listening to the audiobook and I just wanted something to listen to while I crocheted, I just listened to the whole thing. Like, it was interesting enough and I liked the audio version of it. I thought the narrator was very good and it had these like special effects added to it, so like if she was talking on the phone, the person on the phone would actually sound like a phone conversation, or there's several parts of this book where she's listening to like an audio recording and it sounds like an audio recording. So I thought those little effects were a nice touch to the audiobook, but overall I just think the concept of like, you know, these games and stuff is a lot more interesting in theory than it actually was in this book. So I also wish I would have known that this was set during the holidays because I probably would have saved it to read during the holidays. There's like a whole Krampus game that they play in here, which again, I think I actually maybe would have enjoyed that scene better if I was reading it physically, but besides that, I just found it a little bit boring. It was just another one of those like mystery thrillers where it's like, it's interesting enough to finish, but a month from now, I definitely will forget what this book was about. And then the final book I picked up in January was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This was my first ever V.E. Schwab book, which I was very excited to pick this up because V.E. Schwab is such a beloved author and I've just never gotten around to picking up one of her books before, but of all of her work, this is the one that has always interested me the most. So in this book, we follow our main character, Addie LaRue, and she basically makes a deal with a demon where she is able to live for a really long time, but in exchange, nobody remembers her. So as soon as a door closes in between her and another person, or they are away from her long enough, they will forget who she is, which makes her life extremely difficult. She's basically forced to live a life of crime because if nobody can remember you, you couldn't possibly get a job because your employer would forget that they hired you. You can't get an apartment or a home because your landlord would forget that they rented to you. So it makes her life incredibly difficult until the year of 2014, because she ends up living through the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, and now it's 2014 and she actually meets someone that does remember her. So I was very intrigued to pick this book up and I was very excited just because I'd heard so many great things about this book and about this author in general, and I don't know if my expectations were just too high, but I was very underwhelmed with this book. Don't get me wrong, I still gave it 3 stars. I still enjoyed it overall and I do think it has a very interesting concept, but personally I didn't love the execution of it. First of all, it took a very, very long time for this story to actually like get going. I feel like we were in the introductory chapters like well over 100 pages into this book, and by that point I felt like I was already starting to like lose steam with the story. Once things actually like got started and our main characters started to actually interact with each other, I did start to enjoy it a bit more, but I still wasn't ever like fully connected with the characters, which could just be a personal preference. I prefer when books are told in the first person. This was told in the third person, and that may have been why I felt a bit of a disconnect with connecting to the characters. By the end of the book, it does actually give a bit of a reason as to why this book is told in the third person, so I guess I can't really fault the book for that too much, but Also, by the end of this book, I was really hoping that it would have a very impactful ending that would kind of make up for the very slow start and stuff like that, but unfortunately I found the ending to be very unsatisfying. It has a very open ending, which is fine for some people, but for me, I really like to have closure. Like some books where I am so invested in these characters, the kind of closure that I'm looking for by the end is straight from when they're born to when they die. Like that's the kind of closure that I like out of some books, but this was very open-ended and just personally for me felt very unsatisfying. So overall I gave it 3 stars. I appreciate the story and I can understand why some people love this book, but I can also understand the people that didn't like this book. I just kind of fall somewhere in the middle. So those were the 8 books that I read in January. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. I'd love to discuss them with you in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye!